Segment 9A, Introduction. Everything changes, and we change right along with everything. In this exciting lecture, Rome will continue trying to deal with both the positive and the negative consequences of being the superpower of the Mediterranean world. The Romans had been reasonably familiar with the ancient Greeks they encountered in Italy. But when they conquered Greece, it turns out, the Greeks in turn conquered the Romans, to use Horace's phrase. Like the Roman Empire, the Roman government was a work in progress, and not all of the progress was positive. As the Roman nation became more wealthy and more powerful, so did individual Romans. The tension between the wealth and power of individual Romans and the practice of democracy would cause great problems down the line. In segment 9B, Romans and Hellenism, we take up the Romans' love-hate relationship with the ancient Greeks. After the conquest of Greece, Romans rediscovered Hellenism. The cosmopolitan Greek lifestyle developed in classical mainland Greece and spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean by Alexander the Great. Hellenism opened up a new world of art, literature, and creature comforts, far beyond what the mos maiorum prescribed. The Romans would tend to look down their nose at the Greeks for being soft and frivolous and unable to rule themselves effectively. Yet the Romans wholeheartedly admired the Greeks' cultural achievements and adapted many Greek customs and Greek technologies for their own use. Some they just took over outright. The result was a truly Greco-Roman civilization, which served as the foundation for what we'll call the Roman Empire. In segment 9C, the costs of success, Rome wrestles with the social costs of her success, most notably the decline of Rome's former backbone, the small farmer class. Killed off in Rome's wars, or run off of their farms by agribusiness concerns called latifundia, the former small farmers had nowhere to run but the cities, and this usually meant Rome. Rome evolved politically during this time, but only in certain ways. Allowing the plebeians, wealthy plebeians that is, to hold political office and to marry patricians was a positive change. The so-called noble class, or nobilitas, which sprang up from the mixture of classes, brought needed fresh blood into Roman leadership. But on the other hand, little, if anything, was done for the urban poor, even by those politicians who pretended to care about their interests. The urban poor had little to look forward to and little hope of bettering their lot in life. The same was true of Rome's Italian allies. The Italian allies were expected to contribute men and money to Rome's war efforts, but because they were not citizens, they got nothing in return. Segment 9D, Rise of Militarism, explains what happened when Rome's growing empire required more and more soldiers, only to find that the small farmer class was gone. For decades, the neglected small farmer class had been moving into the city, becoming poor, and therefore becoming ineligible for military service. When the need for soldiers became too great, generals such as Marius and Sulla recruited, trained, and paid entire armies at their personal expense. These client armies achieved great things for Rome in the last decade of the 2nd century BC. But they also set an awful precedent. These client armies were loyal to their generals first, and only then loyal to Rome. Marius did indeed dismiss his client army after his last consulship in 100 BC, but future warlords would not show similar restraint. Segment 9B, Romans and Hellenism. Roughly a quarter of a century ago, the deluxe yours truly was a sophomore at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. It's hard to believe. I was frankly astonished to be passing first-year Latin. And I was shocked when my Latin professor told me that I had to start first-year ancient Greek at the beginning of my junior year. My anguished question was, but why? Was answered with this fundamental truth of classical studies. You cannot be an educated Roman without being an educated Greek. This was true to an extent from the beginning of Roman history. Though the Etruscans were by far the biggest outside influence upon Roman civilization, the Greeks had undeniably influenced the Etruscans. For all intents and purposes, the Etruscans' deities were renamed ancient Greek deities, and the Romans' deities were basically renamed Etruscan deities. Yet there were more sources of Greek influence. Even before the first little settlements on the hills which later became Rome, the Greeks had been quite active in colonizing Sicily and southern Italy. Rome traded and fought with Greek-speaking Italian cities to the south, and may well have had dealings with mainland Greece too. Although not everyone believes this to be a fact, some say the Romans sent a fact-finding mission to Greece before drafting the Code of 12 Tables around 450 BC. Yet even then, the Romans were not above holding a little bit of resentment. Note that the Romans particularly cherished the myth about Aeneas founding Rome, precisely because he wasn't just a Trojan hero of divine lineage. It was because he was a Trojan as opposed to a Greek. The conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BC reintroduced Romans to Greek culture, or Hellenism, in a much greater way. The term Hellenism describes a culture adapted from the classical ancient Greeks and spread through the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East by the conquests of one Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Even after Alexander's empire crumbled, and after the Romans conquered the empires of Alexander's successors, Alexander's Hellenistic ways and customs took root and survived. Roman soldiers who had experienced Hellenistic life came back home describing luxuries on a scale previously unimaginable to a culture steeped in the mos maiorum. Greeks reclined at dinner instead of sitting bolt upright. Greek homes were comfortable and attractively designed. Greeks worshipped in huge, beautiful temples and attended dramatic performances in giant theaters where they sat down. Romans were impressed at the attentions Greek paid to their food and to their dress and even to their music. To the simple small farmers who grew their own food and wore the clothes their wives made for them. The Hellenistic culture of Greece was positively dazzling. Educated Romans were impressed further by the range of arts and literature and by the scientific advancement of the Greeks. The Romans' own intellectual achievements seemed all of a sudden rather scanty, and it became a point of Roman pride to match Greek cultural achievements whenever possible. The military achievements of the Greeks, their great successes and great failures, were studied eagerly by Roman generals. Some unusually enlightened Romans, such as the family of Scipio Africanus, believed that Greek philosophy and the study of Greek political institutions could even improve Roman government. To this fact, we owe the writings of the Greek Polybius and his study of the Roman constitution, which was written in Greek. It soon became customary for wealthy Romans to have their own Greek teachers and Greek philosophers at home, many of whom were still slaves. They preferred slavery in many cases in a wealthy Roman family to freedom in their native Greece. By the 1st century BC, it had also become customary for wealthy young Romans to attend public speaking schools in Greece, taking instruction in Greek and delivering orations in Greek. They spoke Latin in public life, but often switched to Greek in private. From the 2nd century BC on, to be an educated Roman, one more and more now had to be an educated Greek. Yet not everyone was uniformly thrilled by this mania for all things Greek. The more traditional Romans referred to Hellenophilia as emulatio, a term meaning envy of the Greeks. Cato the censor, the leader of Carthage, insisted that Hellenism would shatter the mos maiorum and bring the Roman world to its knees. He pretended not to know any Greek himself. In 155 BC, he even ordered that Greek philosophers residing in Rome had to be run out of town. Cato himself protested far too much. He wrote a history of Rome, which drew upon Greek models and Greek sources. His anti-Hellenism was mainly a political show against the Scipio Africanus family, which embraced Hellenism. Greek comedies and Greek tragedies were translated into Latin and performed in Rome before enthusiastic crowds. But the audiences had to stand or sit in temporary bleachers erected for every festival, because the idea of permanent theaters somehow went against the mos maiorum. Moreover, the worldly, sophisticated comedy characters in these translated plays were portrayed as Greeks, so as not to offend Roman sensibilities. Roman dramatists who claimed the traditional Hellenistic freedom of speech sometimes found themselves in prison thinking of ways to get out. As a nation, the Romans were typically free of self-esteem issues. They were secure knowing that despite their apparent cultural inferiority, they had conquered and pacified the entire Greek world. They were big enough to admit the Hellenic culture was superior in many ways. Yet I believe they never entirely let go of the idea that the Greeks were somehow still a little more civilized. As Rome became more powerful and more interested in shaping how people saw Roman culture, Romans became concerned that Roman art and Roman literature should reflect Rome's special place in the world. Having Greeks like Polybius write about the Roman Constitution, that was great. But the Roman Constitution really was best explained by a Roman political scientist. Ironically, the Roman art and Roman literature which resulted invariably resembled Greek models in one way or another. This helps explain why the Roman civilization of the empire is most often known as Greco-Roman. Although the Romans would never entirely lose their envy of Greek accomplishments, their admiration never faded away either. Ironically, this Greco-Roman culture would later be carried on by the Byzantines, a Greek-speaking people which called itself the Romaioi, which is ancient Greek for the Romans. Segment 9C, the costs of success. Rome's conquests had brought new ager publicus, new prisoners of war to be slaves, and other material riches. Combined with the cultural wealth of the Hellenistic tradition, it was all good. But serious trouble lay just beneath the surface. Without an official plan for dispersing the spoils of war, the generals and the Senate were free to do as they pleased with the booty. This, of course, helped the wealthy aristocrats more than it helped the plebeian slugs who actually fought the wars. Supposedly, the ager publicus was merely lent to the victorious generals, the senators, or their friends, but then as now, possession was 9/10 of the law. Advances in agriculture and the booming number of slaves had made it profitable to run large-scale plantations, or latifundia. Naturally, the wealthy patricians who wound up with the ager publicus, the public land, were in perfect position to make a killing. They could have their latifundia worked with cheap slave labor, driving their small farmer neighbors out of business. Best of all, they could pretend to be honoring the mos maiorum by being successful farmers. Since the remaining small farmers could not compete with the latifundia, they were lucky just to survive. That is, the farmers who had survived the Second Punic War. The widows of soldiers who died in the war, uncompensated for the loss of their husbands, usually sold their land to latifundia operators at ridiculously low prices. Some small farmers left because they couldn't even afford to pay their taxes. With nowhere else to go, these former small farmers and their families were forced to move to the big city, which was almost always Rome. By this time, the old patrician plebeian breakdown had faded away, surviving only in the office of the tribunate and in the existence of the popular assembly. Thanks to the Sextio-Licinian laws of 367 BC, the classes had been permitted to intermarry. This brought fresh blood into the upper class, and it gave ambitious and gifted plebeians something to shoot for. The old patrician class had been replaced by the nobility. Membership in this new noble class was determined by being elected consul or by being the descendant of somebody who had been elected consul. Rome was still, surely, an oligarchy in keeping with the dear old mos maiorum. It's just that plebeian blood had revitalized the old ruling class. As elsewhere, Rome profited from its adaptability in allowing social mobility. The only drawback to being a member of the noble or senatorial class was that senators were expected to be above having business interests. According to the mos maiorum, it was assumed that senators were already wealthy farmers in need of no additional income. Since they still wanted additional income, because who doesn't, the latifundia were the perfect business venture. Romans who chose not to be in the senatorial class and compete for slots on the cursus honorum could belong to the equestrian class, or also known as the class of knights. Once a term for Roman soldiers who served as cavalrymen, the equestrian case of Rome's late republic was made up of those who chose to focus upon business interests instead of politics. These men were often, but not always, from less established families and less wealthy temporarily. Some equestrians later aspired to becoming members of the senatorial class, but for the most part, equestrians were happy making money and adopting individual senators as their patrons. Also about this time, politicians began to sort themselves out into two factions called optimates and populares. Neither faction, the optimates and populares, could be called a political party in the American sense. Neither had a particular agenda or worldview other than getting the people who belonged to it elected to the cursus honorum. The factions differ primarily in the noises they made in order to get political office. The populares talked furiously about their deep concern for the Roman masses. They applauded the powers of the tribunes and appealed to the council of the plebeians, but basically they just wanted to get elected. The optimates, for their part, tended to be the members of great noble families from days gone by, and tended to make noises about preserving the glorious mos maiorum. As for the masses themselves, they seemed to see politics more as entertainment than anything else. Their votes were less important by tradition than those of the wealthy, but they genuinely enjoyed the drama of the annual political campaigns and the stray handouts they got at election time. The tribunes, who were supposedly protectors of the people and had the power to veto anything which might endanger the people, were usually bought and paid for by one or the other faction and neutralized. In the 130s and 120s BC, the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus used the powers of the tribuneship to its utmost. They tried to help the dispossessed small farmers and other urban riffraff. They were both of the very noblest blood. Their mother, Cornelia, was a patrician, the daughter of Scipio Africanus. But they realized something had to be done. Elected tribune for 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus tried to bolster the citizen military by taking ager publicus from the wealthy and giving it to the landless poor. This was, of course, interpreted as trying to build up a clientele. When Tiberius stepped down from his second tribunate, right at the beginning of 131, the Optimates raised up a mob and had him killed. Elected tribune a decade later, Gaius Gracchus took up his brother's program, along with a program allowing citizenship for all of Rome's Italian allies. While both of these initiatives were laudable, even necessary, the aristocracy, the Optimates, played on fears again of the Gracchi violating the mos maiorum, trying to make themselves king of a personal clientele. Like his brother before him, Gaius was murdered by Optimate mobs in 121 BC. The aristocratic Optimates had gained the upper hand over the reformers, and ambitious tributes thought twice before messing with the establishment. This was only for the time being, though. Something would have to give, and within 15 years, it did. Segment 9D, the rise of militarism. The Roman way of war changed right along with Roman society. No longer could Romans drop the plow after the spring planting, fight all summer long, and then come back home in time for the harvest. More and more, Rome's wars took place over the seas and far away, forcing Roman soldiers to fight for extended periods of time without any chance of coming home, unless they were lucky enough to survive the war. Because the Roman citizens could hardly support themselves under such conditions, the state instituted a salarium, or a stipend given soldiers to buy important things like food, weapons, clothing, and especially salt. That said, a Roman soldier was more likely to get killed than he was of getting wealthy. His family at home had to fend for itself, and even if he did make it home in one piece, there was no question of receiving a pension. Even though Rome's military was greatly helped by the addition of allied troops, who served under the same lousy conditions, the core of trained Roman citizen soldiers was in danger of falling apart. As mentioned before, the small farmer class was already crumbling under the economic pressure of the latifundia. The Optimates, who controlled the Senate, had proven their determination to stamp out, even kill, any reforms. On the other hand, a strong Roman military was becoming even more crucial than it had been in Rome's early robbery years. A century of conquest forced Rome to maintain a permanent military presence in the provinces to forestall rebellion. As mentioned earlier, Roman pro-magistrates ruled their provinces like petty kings, with little, if any, thought for the province's unfortunate inhabitants. Consequently, revolts were numerous, often sparked by reactions to the local publicani. Publicani were contractors who paid the government for the right to collect Roman taxes in a certain locale. Since the publicani's profit depended on how much money they could extort from a province, they were often very brutal. The proconsul or propraetor was always willing to back up the local publicani for a cut of the take. This only worsened Rome's reputation with the provincials. Finding enough soldiers to keep the peace had become rather difficult. Roman citizens had once considered military service a privilege, not an obligation. No more. The prospect of 20 years spent patrolling dangerous lands and dangerous provinces for minimum pay was a poor recruiting tool. Many small farmers who somehow survived the establishment of latifundia dodged the draft by abandoning their farms for the city. Even in the city, work was hard to find. Most of the skilled craftsmen in the city were themselves slaves. Even the great Roman aristocrats, who wished to glorify Rome's greatness by building great monuments, naturally had the work performed by slaves. It was far easier for these poor people, who had once been the backbone of the Roman state, to find a kindly patron in the city and hang on to him for dear life. Because the Roman aristocracy would not do anything to help the Roman small farmer, Roman generals such as Gaius Marius, consul 106, 104, 103, 102, 101, 187 BC, and his former lieutenant Lucius Cornelius Sulla, consul 88, dictator 82 through 79 BC, had to recruit and pay soldiers from the Roman lower classes. On the one hand, they had no choice. Yet, on the other, the precedent was disastrous. In 107 BC, Marius recruited Rome's first client army when, as consul, he took over the war against King Jugurtha of Numidia. Marius recruited military-eligible citizens wherever possible, but even for a genuine war, manpower was hard to find. Thus, most of his recruits were in fact landless poor citizens, either Romans or from allied cities, to whom he offered large signing bonuses and promised land upon discharge. He also promised citizenship to large bodies of soldiers recruited from allied cities. Once Jugurtha had been captured, thanks mainly to Sulla, and the war ended in 106 BC, trouble erupted in northern Italy. Germanic tribes had been knocking around the Alps for several years, beating up any Roman army sent to face them. Holding the consulship twice in a row was against the mos maiorum, but the situation here was desperate. Since Rome needed Marius and his army, he was elected 4 times in a row to the consulship: 104, 103, 102, 101. The Germanic tribes defeated, Marius managed to get elected consul for 100 BC, but proved unable to gain any benefits for his faithful troops. Rome was now in a tight spot. Because these veteran soldiers had been recruited, trained, commanded, and paid by Marius, they may have been more loyal to their patron Marius than to Rome. Revolution was not out of the question. Still, Marius folded his cards, dismissed his client army, and went into retirement. He'd be back. At the same time, Rome's Italian allies were becoming upset by their unfair treatment. From the beginning of Rome's expansion, allied city-states were forced to contribute men and money to Rome's foreign wars. Toward the end of the Second Punic War, some estimates state that 2/3 of Rome's forces consisted of soldiers from allied Italian cities. the Allies were carrying out their part of the peace treaties and more, but received next to nothing in return. No war profits, no distribution from the lands, the public lands called the Ager Publicus, no bounties, no prisoners of war to serve as slaves, and certainly no rights. Just before his murder in 121 BC, Gaius Gracchus had advocated granting full Roman citizenship to all peninsular Italy. All that got him was killed. In 91 BC, another tribune, Marcus Livius Drusus, introduced legislation leading to full Roman citizenship for all Italians. All that got him was assassinated. The murder of Livius Drusus led to the social war of 91 to 88 BC. Once it was clear that Rome would never willingly allow Italian allies full citizenship, Italian tribes such as the Samnites seceded from Rome and formed a nation they called Italia. Just as the Confederate States of America was a near carbon copy of the good old USA, Italia was a near mirror copy of Rome. Just like the American Civil War, the fighting between Rome and Italia was as vicious as it was idiotic. How it might have ended is a mystery, but destiny intervened in the form of a terrorist attack by King Mithridates of Pontus. And this is where the Roman theme music comes in. Roman. Okay. Segment 9E, Conclusions. 1. With the necessary changes having been made. Part of the Romans' genius included knowing, at least most of the time, when to deviate from the good old mos maiorum. The Romans' openness to adopting Hellenes shows the Romans at their very best. As it turned out, the Romans did not really become morally weakened by exposure to Greek arts, sciences, or social customs. The Romans' close study of the ancient Greeks' language and literature was an essential step to developing Latin literature and Latin drama. Greek medicine was a massive improvement over its Roman counterpart. And as it turned out, even Greek philosophy had something to offer to the aphilosophical Romans. Even the old school Romans like Cato the Censor, deleter of Carthage, who complained bitterly about Hellenism, learned quite a bit from the Greeks. 2. Meet the new boss. Thanks to the Sexto-Licinian laws of 367 BC, plebeians could be elected to the office of consul. Other changes resulted from the conflict of the orders. The patrician class had been replaced in influence by a new quote-unquote noble class, which included plebeian-based families. That is to say, wealthy plebeian-based families. The major qualifications were membership in the senatorial class, which you got by being elected quaestor, and having an ancestor who had held a consulship. The road was also open to men not born in Rome to become part of the nobility, but this was rare. In practice, only 3 non-senatorial men of any note reached consulship in the history of the Roman Republic. Cato the Elder, we've met him already, Marius, and Cicero. However, even senators from non-noble families were men of influence during the years that they actually held their magistracies. 3. Diversity. Once they got over the conflict of the orders, the Romans were surprisingly well committed to letting people advance socially and politically. This applied not only to the new noble class. The senatorial class was composed of all descendants of formal magistrates, but in principle restricted to those who at least officially stayed out of business life in order to play a role in the Senate. The equestrian class passed up a direct role in public life in order to focus on their business interests. They could, if they wanted, to move up into the senatorial class, but didn't always do so. The equestrian class was also a stepping stone for Italian-born citizens and other non-Roman-born citizens to move into political life. During the Principate, when this commitment to diversity was expanded to include the provinces, Rome was able to draw upon the brightest and most promising people of the entire empire. 4. The seeds that they let grow. The Romans, nevertheless, ignored certain glaring problems until they became catastrophic. Among these were the decline of the small farmer class, the refusal of full Roman citizenship to all Italian allies, and general political corruption. Allowing the small farmer class to disintegrate in Rome's wars of conquest and allowing the latifundia to push the survivors out of business was a big mistake and led to the rise of client armies. The solution would not have been simple, but the Gracchi paid for their lives for trying to find one. Refusal to allow all Italian allies to become citizens could have been fixed with the passage of a law. But it took the death of Livius Drusus, the Social War, and the war against Mithridates to teach the Romans that particular lesson. Finally, political corruption made a mockery of the annual elections with its rampant bribery and other backdoor deals. Optimates jockeyed with populares, and populares jockeyed with optimates, when each was basically just a somewhat different side of the same sad coin. Whoever had the most money and the most clients usually won, which did not bode well for actual democracy. As one of Rome's old enemies observed, Rome was truly a city for sale.